Imagine committing a petty larceny, like shoplifting from a grocery store, and then getting caught. What would your punishment be? At worst, you might get a citation and have to pay a fine, or maybe even get a little community service. But if you lived in England in the late 1700s or early 1800s, you might be banished to an unknown and unsettled land over 10,000 miles away. That's because during this time period, the British would send some of their prisoners, mostly ones who committed petty crimes like theft, all the way to Australia. During the Industrial Revolution, there was an increase in petty crimes all across the UK due to the economic hardships and unemployment caused by the advent of machinery, which replaced the work of men and women. Prisons began filling up with people, and the old prison ships, known as hulks, were unable to accommodate the overflow. Transporting the inmates was introduced to solve the problem, with them first being sent to the British colonies in North America. Once the American War of Independence concluded, the British needed a new place to send the increasing amount of overflow prisoners. It was decided that Australia would be the most suitable destination. But why Australia, which was over 10,000 miles away and took months to get to? Years earlier, Captain James Cook, a British explorer, made 3 trips between 1768 and 1779 to the Pacific Ocean, mapping such places like Australia, New Zealand, and even as far as the Hawaiian Islands and the coast of current-day Oregon. The British wanted to lay claim to Australia, so they decided to send the overflow of prisoners there and set up penal colonies where the prisoners would be sentenced to several years of hard labor, doing whatever was necessary to start the first European settlement in the area. The first batch of prisoners, almost 1,000 of them, along with officers, seamen, and their families, known as the First Fleet, set sail from Portsmouth, southern England, on May 13, 1787. 11 ships left on this historic voyage across the oceans to the other side of the world. The leader of this great expedition was Commodore Arthur Phillip, who had the power to make land grants in this brand new colony and create legislation. It took the First Fleet 8 months to finally reach their destination of Botany Bay on the east coast of Australia, arriving on January 18, 1788. The conditions the prisoners faced on the ships were appalling, and some did not survive the journey, dying from such things as malaria due to the cramped and unhygienic conditions, where space was so limited that inmates were not even able to lay down sometimes. The high mortality rate was made worse by a lack of sufficient supplies, leading to widespread hunger and starvation. About 50 people died during the first expedition, while almost 2,000 prisoners would die in total throughout the years being shipped to Australia. When the First Fleet arrived at Botany Bay, it became quickly apparent that this location wasn't going to work for their first settlement. The bay was too shallow to allow the fleet to anchor close to the shore. The lack of fresh water and poor soil quality added to the lack of potential in the area. Philip and a party of men traveled in 3 smaller vessels in order to explore the coastline further north. The men discovered a bay just to the north in which Philip called the finest harbor in the world. By January 26th, the entire fleet sailed into the new harbor, with Phillips naming the area Sydney Cove, in honor of Lord Sydney, who was the British Home Secretary. This new settlement was called the New South Wales Colony. This was a momentous day, marking the beginning of the first European settlement in Australia. The area has since been developed as the city of Sydney, and January 26th is celebrated as Australia Day. The First Fleet struggled immediately. The ships carried only enough food to provide for the settlers until they could establish agriculture in the area. The plan was to settle in Australia and create large areas of agricultural production, but there was an insufficient number of skilled farmers and domesticated livestock to achieve this. The prisoners were worked hard each day and would receive harsh punishments, such as lashings, if they misbehaved or didn't work hard enough. The struggling First Fleet were looking forward to receiving reinforcements, but the arrival of the Second Fleet in 1790 did not improve the situation. Those excitedly waiting on shore for the new arrivals were greeted with a horrifying sight. Dead and dying men, shocking evidence of abuse, and rampant disease and starvation. Few men could stand upright, struggling to reach the shore, close to death. Most were unable to work, putting added pressure on the already struggling colony. All convicts, who were about 80% male, were to suffer the punishment of hard labor, which consisted of any type of work that was deemed necessary for the settlement. This would include brick making and timber cutting, all of which had to be carried out in sweltering conditions, with little food to sustain them. Most of these prisoners were sentenced to 7 years of hard labor, with some receiving life sentences. Remember, most of these prisoners were convicted of petty crimes, since harsher crimes, such as murder and rape, were punished by death at the time. If a prisoner was well behaved, they could be given a ticket to leave, granting some freedoms during their sentence, similar to being out on parole in today's society. The British set up several penal colonies in the area, with New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land, later named Tasmania, being the two largest penal settlements. There was also Norfolk Island, a penal colony known for its harsh conditions, particularly for those who had committed additional crimes after being transported to Australia. Moreton Bay, established in 1824, was a place for secondary punishment for convicts. And the Swan River Colony in Western Australia, which was initially intended for free settlers, it later became a convict colony. More and more free settlers started to make their way to the land down under. Convicts started to be assigned to free settlers or masters and would do farm work on a free settler's land. By the mid-1830s, only about 6% of the convict population was locked up in a prison. The conditions the prisoners would face would depend on their master, with some being treated well, while others were very cruel. The British public became increasingly critical of this practice, believing it was a form of slavery. The population of free settlers had grown large enough by the mid-1800s that convict labor was no longer needed to sustain the colony. The British government ended transportation to Eastern Australia in 1852. Transportation to Western Australia, which was reduced to a smaller scale in 1850 at the request of the colonists, ended in 1868. In total, about 162,000 British and Irish convicts were transported to Australia from 1788 to 1868. After a prisoner's sentence was served, they would receive a certificate of freedom, which means they were free to settle in Australia or return home to the UK, but at their own expense. Most stayed in Australia and settled in the communities that they helped build, with some ex-convicts becoming respected members of society. Some even were appointed to key positions in the colonial government. It is estimated that a significant portion of the current Australian population are descendants from convicts transported from the UK. Once a stigma, attitude towards convict descent became more accepted in the 20th century and is now considered by many Australians to be a cause for celebration to discover a convict in one's lineage. Thanks for watching. As always, I appreciate it. Please subscribe for more historical videos. Take care.